I will not let them break this peace.
The power grid failed twice that night before it failed for good. Nobody in the banquet hall thought much of the first flicker. They thought even less of the second. I thought about both because I had counted the guards and I had counted the exits, and something about the rhythm of those failures didn't sit right in my gut. My name is Daniel Osei, and that night I was not a soldier. On the roster I was listed as a cultural liaison and personal aide, which was a polite way of saying I got paid to keep an 8-year-old alien heir named Voss out of trouble. His people, the Ithran, had only just signed onto the wider Concord, and half the delegates in that hall still weren't sure humans belonged in a room with cutlery, let alone a room with power. When the lights failed the third time and didn't come back on schedule, I moved before I finished the thought. 6 months before that night, I was nothing to Voss but the ape my father hired. He said it to my face the first week, in front of the kitchen staff, in front of anyone who'd listen. He'd grown up with people bowing before they ever looked at him, and I refused to bow. When he skipped his lessons, I walked him back to the classroom. When he threw his tablet across the room because a broadcast got canceled, I let him sit with being upset instead of fixing it for him. He hated that. He hated me for a while. Then, slowly, something shifted. There was a night he couldn't sleep, shaking from some memory of the war his world had barely survived before joining the Concord. He never told me what he saw. I never asked. I just sat outside his door until his breathing evened out, the same way I used to sit outside barracks doors for soldiers twice his age who couldn't close their eyes either. There was the afternoon older diplomats' kids mocked him for not knowing how to throw a punch, called him soft, called him a princeling who'd fold at the first sign of trouble. I taught him how to make a proper fist in the garden behind the residence, where nobody official could see. His mother would have had my head. I did it anyway. No kid should feel powerless in a room full of adults who claimed to protect him. There was the night I broke about 4 regulations and took him to a street market he wasn't allowed near, wrapped him in a coat 2 sizes too big, and let him eat fried dough out of a paper cone like any other kid on the block. He held on to my sleeve the whole walk back. Not because he needed to, because he wanted to. Somewhere in those months he stopped calling me the aide. Then he stopped calling me Daniel. He started calling me Uncle Dan. The first time he said it, I had to look away so he wouldn't see my face do something undignified. None of that was in my head as I crossed the banquet hall that night, cutting between silk robes and polished armor plating, eyes locked on the 2 men closing in on him from the far side of the dessert table. Concord security stood stiff near the doors, built to catch a diplomatic slight, not a knife. They hadn't clocked the threat yet. I doubted they would in time. I reached Voss just as the first man's hand closed on his shoulder. "Let go of him," I said, and my own voice came out lower than I expected. The man barely glanced my way. To him I was staff furniture, nothing worth the effort of looking at twice. That was his mistake. I caught his wrist, twisted it off Voss, and pulled the boy behind me in the same motion, old muscle memory from a different life, a different war. The second man went for something under his coat. I didn't wait to find out what. I stepped into him instead of back, closed the gap so whatever he was reaching for would be useless in his hand, and knocked it loose before it ever cleared his jacket. It clattered across the marble somewhere behind me, and I heard someone scream, "Side corridor. Go." I told Voss. He hesitated, staring at me instead of running. "Go. Now." That got him moving. I stayed between him and both men as he slipped toward the service door I'd scouted my first night on the job. Always know your exits. Another old habit that apparently never really left me. The first man recovered and came at me again. I used his own momentum to put him into a support column. The second tried to circle wide, aiming for the corridor, for Voss. I wasn't going to let that happen, and for a few seconds it was less a fight than a wrestling match over space. Him trying to get past me refusing to give the ground. Somewhere behind the screaming I heard Concord guards finally shouting, finally moving. Too late, same as always. The second man made his final push. It was short and ugly and over almost before it started. When the guards arrived with weapons raised, both men were down and I was still on my feet, jacket torn, breathing hard. Voss stood exactly where I told him to wait, close enough to have watched the whole thing. That's when I noticed the burn along my ribs I'd been too busy to feel until then. I woke up in a Concord medical bay under lights too bright for how tired I felt. My side was wrapped tight, but I was breathing, and that already put me ahead of some people from that night. Voices filled the room before I opened my eyes all the way. Ithran guards near the door, Voss's father with his arms folded, talking low with a Concord officer whose collar markings I didn't recognize. The human's competence here is, frankly, irregular for domestic staff. The officer was saying, like I wasn't lying 3 feet away and perfectly capable of hearing every word. He was hired to mind a child, Voss's father answered carefully, not to engage armed operatives. And yet he did both. We'll need his file reviewed. Capability like this, unlogged, unsupervised, it raises questions. I wanted to say I hadn't been thinking about logs or supervision. I'd been thinking about getting between Voss and 2 men who wanted him dead. But before I could get a word out, the doors opened and small, fast footsteps crossed the floor before any guard could catch him. You shouldn't be in here, one of them tried. Voss pulled free and kept walking until he reached my bedside, ignoring his father, ignoring the officer, ignoring every rule of protocol that usually wrapped him like a second skin. He is not my aide, he said, loud enough to fill the room, his voice steadier than I'd ever heard it. He is my family. The room went quiet. I watched the officer's expression shift from confusion to something closer to understanding. Watched Voss's father's face change right along with it. I didn't know yet what those words meant under Ithran law. I'd learn later that a declaration like that, spoken by an heir of his rank in front of witnesses, wasn't sentiment. It was binding. It meant something no file review could undo. But lying there with my side aching and my chest tighter than the wound could explain, I wasn't thinking about law. I was thinking about a boy who couldn't sleep because of a war he never chose. A kid who once called me an ape to my face, and the same kid gripping my hand now like he'd never let go. I'm not going anywhere, I told him, and he finally let himself cry. His father stepped closer, his face softening into something I hadn't seen from him before. Thank you, he said quietly, for protecting him. It stopped being a job a long time ago, I said. The officer cleared their throat, already talking about reports and reviews and formal recognitions to be filed. I let it wash past me. None of it mattered as much as the small hand refusing to let go of mine. Word of that night moved through Concord circles faster than any report could contain it. Delegations who'd only ever seen humans as cheap labor started quietly asking about hiring their own. I never wanted the attention. I hadn't fought that night to prove anything about my species. I fought because a boy I'd come to love as my own was in danger, and there was no version of that night where I stood aside. Voss healed faster than I did, kids always do. Within days he was back to lessons and stubborn arguments about bedtime. I healed slower, but every evening after his lessons ended and the residents went quiet, he'd find me and just sit close, not saying much. Weeks later, watching the sun go down over the palace gardens, he asked if I'd been scared that night. Terrified, I told him honestly. Then why'd you do it? I thought about that for a long moment. Because being scared never stopped me from doing what mattered. And you matter more than anything I've ever been afraid of. He leaned into my side, careful of where the wound still ached, and didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I came to that palace as a job title people smiled at and forgot. I stayed because somewhere between homework fights and quiet nights and one desperate scramble across a crowded hall, I stopped being the hired help. I became his, and no title, no treaty, and no law written by careful, cautious officials could ever take that back.